What if lies were used to paint the family photo on the wall? What if quiet itself had the ability to become a weapon? And what actually transpired in Mississippi that night when the grand home was destroyed by fire and a name was obliterated? This is the tale of Abo, Malachi, and the vengeance that manifests itself in ashes. Under the weight of its own quiet, the Willoughby plantation slept. A suffocating stillness rather than one of tranquility. Situated deep within the Mississippi River, it was tucked away in the swamp's breathless vapors and among old cypress trees. The black and heavy dirt seemed to remember things mankind sought to forget, and insects hummed like faint words of judgment. Despite not having been born there, Willoughby had accepted Malachi like a coffin accepts a corpse, without fanfare or choice. Towering, shoulders as worn as ancient tree bark. With the steadiness of a man who has discovered that resistance was louder than survival, he worked the land. He responded to the overseer's nods during the day. At night, he sat next to his wife, Abo, under the slatted shadows of their room, barely talking. They were holy in their quiet. Their gazes spoke for themselves. Ebo exuded a calmness that even the other slaves found frightening. Like ash, her past held on to her. She was said to have once bitten a man's throat to avert an impending attack. According to some, she sang to her dying kid until the fever broke and she lost her voice. However, no one was positive. She didn't talk much. The estate's widow, Vivian Willoughby, governed with a cold stare. Her malice was not audible. Hers was a sophisticated malice, the kind that bound wrists and smirked. She proclaimed that her estate would not deteriorate like so many others once her husband passed away. She asserted that loyalty and devotion are necessary to maintain order, and she meant obedience when she said loyalty. By she meant surrender, not devotion. Vivian called Malachi into the drawing room one morning. Portraits of tough men and frail women lined the walls, all of them gazing down as though they were witnesses to some unsaid atrocity. She talked as like she was conversing with him and gave him tea, which is a terrible act in and of itself. "My sons," she said, pointing to the two gaunt, wiry boys playing in the garden outside the window, "need a man's hand, a father's discipline." "You have a particular gravity, Malachi." He didn't respond. He remained still. As she sipped her tea, she added, "You will be their guide, and I will take care of them as if they were mine. This arrangement is not a form of discipline. Elevation is the cause." The way a man bows to a falling blade, he bowed slightly. Malachi was dragged out of the fields and into the orbit of the method from that day on. He taught the lads how to pray, fish, and carve. Ebo observed from behind a curtain while he worked, of keeping quiet while providing for them, dressing them, and cleaning their mouths as though they weren't her captor's children. Every duty was a bloodless slash. The agreement was discussed with bewilderment by the other slaves. The removal from fieldwork was envied by others. Others felt a darker presence. The Baroness started calling them my family. A macabre tableau of inclusion was the portrait she had commissioned. The guys in front of them, Malachi at her side and Abo behind her, depicted with oils as thick as deceit. In their tiny wooden room, Malachi laid next to Abo at night and listened to the swamp's breath coming through the wall's crevices. She refused to talk. She merely gazed. One night, not out of love or terror, her hand clasped tightly around his wrist. Like everything else between them, it was a non-verbal cue that something was breaking or would soon shatter. The marsh started to breathe as the night became thicker like sap. Like knuckles, the cypress knees emerged from the sea, and a murmur filtered through the reeds in the fog. Ebo initially perceived it as a pressure behind the ribs, a pulse pressing against the bone as though requesting to be let in rather than a sound. Days passed behind a fake peace. With a calm voice, Malachi led the boys. teaching them to be patient with hooks and lines and to pray with their hands clenched so tightly that they turned pale at the knuckles. The Baroness commended the neatness with which grief could be folded and tucked away like linen, the orderliness of routines and the cleanliness of objects. However, as the smoke in the sky diminished with each evening, stood at the edge of the quarters with a view of the water. The tint of her silence changed. Absence was no longer the case. It was a listening session. With a lace of phrases that were not part of the house language, the murmur swept across the surface. They arrived from a location without a map, before the home and before the road. In the same way that animals sense thunder before a cloud appears, Malachi observed her as he would watch a storm approaching. He made an effort to penetrate the fragile shell of silence by speaking softly. Her. He saw a sort of midnight daylight in her eyes as she moved her face. There was no reflection, only depth. The eldest of them, Uma, moved with the gradual assurance of roots. Years and the weight of names twisted his back. He and Malachi conversed in threads while sitting by a dying fire. He said that the earth sleepwalks. It pretends to rest and moves. If a tyrant is kept silent, it will cradle him. But as soon as a single true word is spoken, it will roll and overthrow him. The term is not used when oral cavity. The spine is used to speak it. Increasing her visits to the quarters, the Baroness smiled with the porcelain ease of a self-righteous person. She reminded Ebo of her responsibilities, buttons to tighten, bruises to ignore, and lullabies to hum to children other than her own while touching her shoulder as if to bless her. Ebo bowed even though her breath caught. The murmur lifted, and the bow was shallow. The lads argued over a fishing lure one Sabbath afternoon. Blood ticked as one pushed and the other collapsed. From his mouth. With a calmness that concealed a trembling, Malachi tore them apart. From the porch, the Baroness watched, delighted at the demonstration of paternal authority, and referred to it as harmony. The word was like a bone stuck in Malachi's throat. The frogs went silent when Ebo uttered a single word in an unidentified dialect that evening. Slowly, as though a door had opened behind him, Uma turned his head. With a gentle hiss, the flames spread to a red seam. In the silence that a form trailed behind, unhurriedly drawing recollection like a net through the cane. The myth that Uma was carrying came to reality. Footsteps and debts are remembered by the soil. Rivers maintain a ledger. Faces are learned via cypress roots. Unspoken wrongs grow in the dark and come back heavier than water bringing a drowning tree to the surface. One must call the earth by its true name and ask it to decide, he continued in order to break the spell. Thoughts of Malachi sleeping without sleeping, fluttering like birds stuck in a trap. He had broken obedience down into manageable chunks to master it. But every fresh piece stuck more firmly than the one before it. He felt heat as he gripped Ebo's hand, a silent fever that marked the skin with resolve rather than burning it. The marsh let out a breath as the wind twisted through the moss before daybreak. Ebo got up, cleaned her hands in the sink, and carefully fastened her headscarf. She avoided glancing at Malachi. She didn't must. The whisper had turned into a promise. As though the sun itself was hesitant to be seen above Willoughby, the morning of the portrait arrived with a pale, worn-out light. As one coax lies in a pleasing form, Vivian makes order out of cloth and buttons to outfit her little court in elegance. The swamp would never forgive Ebo for being drawn into silk that was not hers. As the artist mixed paint the way a priest combines doctrine, Malachi stood where he was placed, a motionless figure, muttering about dignity and balance. The frozen position of acceptance lasted for hours. After fidgeting, the boys watched Malachi's breath move like a metronome to learn how to be steady. With the composure of a salt-carved saint, brittle and shining. Vivian grinned. There was no reflection in Ebo's eyes. Glazing terror into shine, the artist paused at them, agitated, and then set his brush anyway. Vivian proclaimed the canvas a sign of grace at the conclusion of the sitting. Like an empty cup, the word grace echoed throughout the home. That night, visitors arrived, including planters from nearby counties and men who smelt the air for vulnerability in the same way that dogs scent a trail. Vivian's brother, Lucian, who wore metropolitan manners like a new coat of varnish over crooked timber, appeared among them. He commended the estate's order and the orderliness of the chain of command to obedience. There was the weight of hands in his laughing. After dinner, Lucian discovered Ebo by himself close to the storage, where maize dust was floating like a light mist. He talked as if he were talking about the weather, as if her body, as if it were a porch to rest on. As one clutches a blade behind the back, Ebo maintained the silence. Malachi came out of the shadows with a determination that required no volume when his voice fell to a private register. With a sardonic smile, Lucian called forth men as the moment hung on a thin reed. What transpired was a ceremony rather than a lesson. With the stark arithmetic of necessity, Malachi absorbed boots and fists. They were more enraged by his refusal than by any disobedience, and he did not fall easily. He walked like a cracked bell while in grief, still able to make a sound but with a new note that no one could ignore. The Baroness described it as a regrettable miscommunication. Forget, the lads were told. Ebo didn't cry. There was a void in her face so full it was practically glowing. The quarters talked in low tones of snakes, sorrow, and the thirst for water until she disappeared that night. For 3 days, the swamp did not give her back after taking her in its breath. Uma merely stated that the earth had provided her with a listening room. Without rain, thunder swept across the horizon on the second dusk. Like a flood discovering the shore it desires, Ebo stepped back over the threshold on the third dawn. The hush she carried lifted the hairs on her forearms. As though starting a new prayer, she began working, pausing in the middle of each sentence. The paint settled into its final lying as the painting dried in the storage loft. From the point where Ebo's likeness was placed to the Baroness's smile one afternoon, a break appeared in the varnish. A tiny white line that covers a wound like frost. Nobody said they had touched it. Malachi, who was below, sensed the change in weight in the air and the beams. The house recalibrated for a minute, as though it had taken a breath and decided not to release it. That night Malachi saw that patience may also be sharpened when the murmur of the marsh swelled and braided itself to Ebo's breathing. The house reclined on its creaky spine as dusk bled into the woods, counting its comforts like a miser counts coins. Malachi paced the hours as though using a string to measure them. One by one, he discovered the estate's rhythms, much to how a hunter learns to read prey's respiration. The smell of terror vanished when the overseer's pipe cooled, the kitchen became silent, and the dogs turned while they slept. Ebo remained silent as he watched him. Her eyes were like a lantern, revealing everything without casting any light. Boxed in dust, the shattered portrait waited in the loft like a prophecy. Malachi had learned in private that polish may split and reveal the bare board underneath. He started experimenting with tiny order hinges. A latch was removed, then reinstalled. After mastering its language, a key lifted and came back. A door that, except for him, squealed. His patience became like a towel wrapped around a sword. Every afternoon, the younger child ventured further, putting on a daring show to win over a mother who valued poise over warmth. He ventured to the brink of the ancient well, where a rope hung like a pledge. In the same tone he used for prayer, Malachi issued a warning. The youngster chuckled, a clean, ignorant wound of luxury in his mouth. The chuckle did not come back on a day of bloated heat. The chain of the bucket clattered against the stone, then ceased. There was a quiet that was too thick for chance. The customs of the estate trembled. Vivian's sorrow swiftly organized itself into performance and then blame. Malachi remained silent. As one retains a word before choosing to speak, the swamp held its breath while stood at the doorway with her hands closed. Say it. The night collected its fragments. The ledger had turned a page, Uma said. The chambers hissed as Vivian tightened her regulations. Later, lanterns burnt. Despite walking in pairs, the watchman's gaze kept straying to the spot where the boy's giggle had been. Malachi made no changes to his looks. No one else could hear the ticking of a clock. Within, he also analyzed angles with every tick, from the parlor to the nursery, the pantry to the cellar, and the stair to the corridor. Fire did not argue. He understood it. It made a decision. The air was as thick as wool on the third night. A smell of rain and iron rose from the swamp, but it never materialized. Ebo placed a palm against the floorboards and knotted her scarf in a sailor's knot. After taking a long breath, she finally spoke. The short, gentle words, formed by a distant nation, held the weight of a decision. She claimed that the earth had woken up. Malachi raised the candle. Oil moved like a shadowy eye. He strolled, alongside the calm surety of moving beyond the sleeping halls of power, past the ghostly portraits that seemed to look through walls, and into a story that has already been told. He didn't turn around. Ebo followed all the way to the veranda and remained there like a judge waiting for the jury to return, not as a widow at a grave. The dogs remained motionless. The crickets maintained a count. He drew a map of distance, in his blood within. The door to the room where Vivian maintained her small altar of order, the linen closet to drape, the curtain to gaze at, and the door to stare at polished keys, ribbons, and ledgers. Only things that welcomed flame were touched by him. Cloth muttered. Oil concurred. Like a confession released from a throat, the lamp lowered. A mouse scuttled across Providence somewhere. Only once did he stop by a cradle that was empty of a child. The void echoed. His hand was held back by recognition rather than mercy. A few rooms were disciplined. Themselves. He went on. As if on a long reed through water, he heard Ebo's breath reach him in the silence before the first lick of heat. It made his bones more stable. There was no drama as the match started. A little boy was born in a home where night was treasured. The wick gave up to its destiny. Its first statement was written by smoke. Malachi took a step back into the hallway. The lamp is now brighter, for bearing some of its burden. For the first time in years, the house let out a ragged sigh, and he moved toward the front. Ebo did not recoil outside. A single fact that moved from one heartbeat to the next broke the silence between them, not words. The planet had listened and responded. The house's actual size became apparent at midnight. As if reading a scripture that had been preserved in dust for years, fire measured it by bone and by breath, licking along cornices. The first timbers let out a sigh. With a thankfulness that sounded like sorrow, the next gave way. The curtains were unstitched by heat. Glass came to its knees when it discovered a language that was older than windows. A piano somewhere inside shaved its lacquer and exposed its ribs, singing a final tiny note before silence, covered its mouth with its palm. Vivian passed through those chambers as though he were negotiating with fire. The halls raced backward from her voice as she yelled names that had previously been named. The loft's portrait broke open along its previous seam. Like leaves in the wind, color lifted and curled at the edges. As the varnish blistered, the painted kids maintained their brittle smiles. Until smoke folded it into sleep, Ebo's likeness remained unwavering, uncertain. Of which order to save, the overseer woke up to cinders in his neck, ran, halted, and ran again. Men stood in queues with empty buckets and late-arriving curses. As the arithmetic was completed, the dogs watched with their muzzles on their paws. Unblinking, Ebo stood at the balcony rail. She did not soften or stiffen her face. It resembled a verdict that had already been read. Malek emerged through a gap that the flames had not yet claimed when the roof fell and the staircase crumbled into amber ruin. Soot had either exposed his features or created a mask out of them. He didn't glance in either direction. He passed the well that held its counsel, the garden where tiny footprints had dried like fossils, and into the cypress air that the marsh received. He is like a whisper that the night has been waiting for. According to some, he traveled a hummocked path that only the deceased are aware of. As if thanking an invisible congregation, others claim to have witnessed him halt, raise his hand toward the veranda, and then lower it. The estate smoked like the dying flame of a sermon by daybreak. Pronouns were used instead of rooms. Never again, here, once, there. The visitors who had remained in the outbuildings stayed out of Abo's sight and wore ash-like pennants. Although pieces of the Baroness's domain were scattered all over the place, her body was never located. A ledger with burnt edges but readable figures, keys fused to ribbon, and a ring welded to a bone-white plate. Uma used her fingertip to turn each page and nodded, as though a balance that had been entered long ago had been cleared. The neighbors came with a geometry of blame and wagons of advice. Lawmen went around and inquired as to how a fire spreads faster than feet, how the watchman failed to see anything, and how water loses a boy and then keeps his twin from comprehending. Ebo responded by providing the precise word count needed to be free and human. No badge could break the authority of her silences, which filled the rest. The quarters turned into a tiny republic of ash and caution when they requested for Malachi, to which she replied, "The earth does not return what it chooses to keep." Ebo prepared bread and bandages, taught the youngest how to use vinegar and patience to remove smoke from their hair, and listened to nightmares until they learned how to lie down next to a toothless sleeper. She placed the keys in the mud at the base of a cypress, bright like a shut eye. Her hands were steadier than those of anyone who stood close to her, and she frequently sat at the doorway, seemingly pouring something invisible from one realm into another. A person at dusk near the levee, a shape traversing a flooded field where no dry land lay. Sightings proliferated like moss. Prints on an upstream-facing sandbar. According to Uma, Malachi was the refrain in the psalm that the swamp was writing. Youngsters started placing little offerings in careful circles that foxes could see, such as a pin, a fish scale, or a nail without a head. Walked around. When it did rain, it did so slowly and without thunder. With a sound like ascent, the dirt absorbed it. Ebo laid one palm on the ash and moved over the black edges of the foundation until it cooled beneath her flesh. Her voice came back as a precise and sparse decree rather than a melody, a language that could understand both ghosts and ledgers. Syllable by syllable, she called out the names of those who had been reduced in size and raised them back up. It is said that on certain evenings, the veranda accumulates weight beneath invisible steps. When the well erupts in laughter and ends before it can be identified, when the scent of wet rope and lacquer is followed by a clear air. During those evenings, the land recounts its story through the soft sound of leaves rustling one another. As gently as breath, the ashes respond, and the narrative never ends if you listen to it long enough. All it does is loop, rescored by water and wind. No fire can destroy what is getting closer to the truth.